Baseload electricity sources like coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and are the foundation of a functioning and stable utility grid. As utilities seek to decarbonize, intermittent sources of electricity like solar and wind are experiencing rapid growth, but are less reliable. This creates a unique challenge. As more solar and wind resources come online, investment in energy storage capacity is required to maintain grid stability and reliability. So, how do utilities view the prospect of geothermal as a green baseload energy source? How do we balance the need for baseload with the growth of intermittent energy sources as we proceed through the energy transition? Should geothermal receive a premium for its status as clean baseload? Let's explore.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion. Having a great first day of Pivot, and want to first thank the organizers for putting on such a great conference where I've already learned a lot, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more learning to go for the rest of the week. We have, I think, a really interesting session for y'all where we're specifically looking to understand the perspective of utilities as it comes to geothermal. And as y'all know, there's been a lot of changes in the market recently that have driven a lot more interest in geothermal, and we're going to be discussing that on this panel, but geothermal is also in many ways a very challenging resource to develop. So we're going to discuss that quite a bit too. I'm also glad that we've got several perspectives represented here. As you all know, utilities are important in providing both electricity and heat, both things that geothermal can do. So we're going to cover that from both perspectives. And we're also going to talk at both the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States and a lot in between, and then have some perspective from the international environment. So very much looking forward to this discussion. By way of intro, I'm Tim Latimer. I've known Jamie in the Texas Geo organization for years and am excited to be participating in another well-run event that they are putting on. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fervo Energy. Fervo Energy is a company that has developed new technology around horizontal drilling, distributed fiber optic sensing, and other subsurface innovations to try to increase the predictability and lower the cost of geothermal development. We've got several active projects right now throughout the Western United States. And I'm personally looking forward to this panel because rather than the utilities peppering the developers and technology companies with questions, I get to pepper the utilities with questions for a little bit. So very much looking forward to this. And I'll just go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves quickly, maybe starting with Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Timothy, and I appreciate the invite to be here. Jason Rondeau from LADWP. I'm the director of our Resource Planning, Development, and Programs Division, and we're responsible for all the renewable procurement and long-term planning and a number of our distributed resource programs as well. And I think you all are aware of this, we'll probably get into this, but we recently completed an LA 100% renewable energy study that had a lot of interesting findings with regards to geothermal. So happy to be here.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason. And I think with the completion of that LA 100 study that y'all did in coordination with NREL, y'all may have thought as much, if not more, about how you get to 100% carbon-free grid as any major power provider. So very excited to get your insights there. Next up, Owen, I think if you would introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm Owen Brady-Tracek from National Grid, and I'm the manager of our Future of Heat non-pipeline alternatives team, which is located within our customer group. So we're constantly thinking about how we can serve our gas customers, help them meet their energy needs, and at the same time incorporate new technologies and support our transition to a decarbonized energy system.
Great, thanks, Owen. And I'm really glad that this panel and the Jamie and the Pivot team has structured it well, where we're not just talking about electricity, we're also talking about heat, and that's just as important. So really excited to have your perspective. And finally, Michael, if you want to quickly introduce.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Michael Weber. Pleased to be on this panel. I have two roles. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, where I do a lot of education and research on energy systems for a low carbon future. And I'm also Chief Science and Technology Officer at ENGIE, headquartered in Paris, France. And ENGIE is a huge company that deals with gas and electricity and infrastructure services. And we're thinking about decarbonization, and we're in the space of geothermal now, so we can talk about that. I'll be at NG just a few more weeks officially, then return to the university full time. So I have a little bit of a multinational utility view, but also some academic view. So thanks so much for inviting me. Glad to be part of the conversation.
Introduce yourself. Great, thank you. Really excited to get your perspective as well. I think understanding the international utility landscape is very important for this conversation as well. So with that, I think we'll transition into some discussions around geothermal. I think one thing that I want to tee up this conversation with is a theme we've heard throughout the morning and afternoon already, which is that this is the geothermal decade. And there's a lot that's happening on the market side that is making geothermal more interesting than it has been really at any other point in time. And just to kind of put two concrete things out there that are both specific to the US, but I'm sure we can easily come up with great international examples. But number one, I would say the focus on deep decarbonization, really for the first time in history, where if you think about state level renewable portfolio standard targets or elsewhere, up until just a few years ago, the most ambitious that anybody was thinking about was 10% or 20% or 33%. And we're now in a world where many different jurisdictions, including ones that are represented on the panel here, have laws on the books to get that to 100% carbon free. And we know that that's a very different challenge than getting to a low level of renewable energy. And that's just something that started in the US context a few years ago with Hawaii, and then California with SB 100 showed leadership there, and now many states have followed suit. But it's a very recent thing, and it's been really important in encouraging things like the LA 100 study that Jason will talk about in a bit here. The second thing that I want to talk about to frame this panel about what's different now is, as people know about whenever it comes to electricity and heat, it's very often out of sight, out of mind. As long as the lights stay on and as long as people's houses stay warm or cool, nobody really thinks about it. And we've been in an interesting position in the last couple of years where California has experienced rolling blackouts, where Texas experienced the Texas freeze, where many people lost power for 5 days or more. And even a place like New York just a couple of weeks ago had their flex alert go out saying that there was imminent potential shortages in electricity. So there's a unique point in time right now where the general public is actually paying attention to reliability and forcing we, the stakeholders that deliver that reliable system, to really think about it differently. So both of these things are really things that are driving interest in the geothermal market. Geothermal is a unique resource that can work 24/7. It's a carbon-free resource, and it has all these attributes going to it. But we've got to do a lot to kind of seize this decade and actually make this take off more. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of overarching commentary. One of the most common questions I get is, what's different now? And those two things are probably, from the market side, the two things that I can articulate that are the most different, and want to keep that in mind as we have this conversation. But with that, would love to do another trip around to the panelists, and each of these organizations has really unique experience in geothermal development. And I wanted all the panelists to have the opportunity to talk about that a little more. So I think maybe we'll go with the same order and kick it off with you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. And interesting that you had mentioned that phrase "seize the decade," because one of the findings that we have is that no matter which way we get to 100%, the next 10 years there's going to be a lot of common investments that we need to make, including more geothermal. So you had talked about past investments that we have, and to give you kind of a ballpark of what it looks like from LADWP's perspective, right now we've got about 350 megawatts of geothermal in our resource, and our peak load, for reference, is about 6,500, and we know that we've got more and more geothermal coming online. We just recently, a couple of years ago, signed a portfolio contract with Ormat that started bringing resources online as far back as 2017, and they're still coming online, and they'll be completed by the end of, I believe, next year. We've also have a few more projects from the earlier history, but what is really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, we actually tried to tap into a resource that's a little bit further east of the Los Angeles area near the Salton Sea. And it kind of highlighted one of the challenges that I think many utilities will have with accessing geothermal, which is, how do you get it to the utility? How do you get it to the load center? There's a lot of really great opportunities. So we actually had a transmission line project. It ultimately didn't pan out. And we had quite a bit of ambition in that area, which could have brought in hundreds of more megawatts to the city of LA. But the lesson that we know now is that challenges and obstacles aside, that the amount of geothermal that we'll have to bring into our resource stack is going to grow. From a very, very high level, we know that our resources will have to double. So we've got, if you look at all the resources we got available today, it's over 10,000 megawatts. That's going to have to double in the next 15 to 20 years, which I think a lot of people thought was probably true, that you'd have to have quite a bit more to keep pace with your load growth, but maybe not that much higher. And I think resources like geothermal can actually help, particularly if there's the ability to provide baseload, kind of bring that overall investment a little bit down, and so you have a little bit more efficient uses of your resources. So I think in the near term, there will be more opportunities, but we've got a lot of challenges with, how quickly can we bring these resources on, and how quickly we can, upgrade our transmission network. And one last thing that I just want to mention is, I think a lot of folks probably don't realize this about LA. We're the biggest municipal utility in the country. We're about 10% of California, but we have about 25% of the transmission capacity in California. So we have a lot of opportunities to reach various resources all across the Western states. So a lot of opportunity for us in the future, and especially, like you said, in the next decade, a ton of work for us.
Yeah, thanks. That's great to hear. And one of the things that always encourages me as somebody in the geothermal industry is looking to California, and particularly looking at the leadership of LADWP and seeing where y'all are. And one of the phrases I say a lot when it comes to decarbonization is that, California isn't unique. California is just first. And so California does a lot of the hard work of driving forward innovation, learning lessons. And if you want to figure out where the rest of the grid is going to go in 5 to 10 years, oftentimes you can look at where California is today. And it gives me a lot of encouragement that LADWP is a leader in the sector, and a group that's put resources like the LA 100 study together has really recognized the value of geothermal. And I think we're going to see that spread around to a lot of other markets and jurisdictions. So really great to have you on this panel and offer that perspective. Owen, I'm curious if you could give us the same perspective from what you're seeing in the market, in your experience.
Of course. And before I do so, Tim, I'd like to just mention one other factor that I think is enabling geothermal potentially, which is the fact that the targets that we're setting are out to 2030, they're out to 2050, which gives us this really long planning horizon, right? And it's a different way to be thinking about investments when you're doing it over decades, as opposed to doing it over a rate case cycle, or as opposed to doing it over the individual decision of a piece of equipment or any of your capital stock as it's rolling over. And so I think by being able to look holistically at the energy system and decide what's going to set us up well for the energy system of the future, that's really a change from how a lot of investments have been made historically across, society in all different sectors. So I think that that's an important factor to think about as well. And it's certainly something that plays in for us as a utility, right? We're used to investing in 50 to 75 year assets and having that work. So we already had that kind of planning horizon in mind. And we're now starting to think about what are the technologies that will be ready to meet needs today, but also be well positioned in the future. And that's really where we started our journey with utility-owned geothermal. Through our energy efficiency programs, we've for years been investing in geothermal heat pump systems where individual customers would sort of sign up for them. But the start of our utility-owned journey was our 2016 rate case for our New York City and Long Island service companies, where we actually filed for doing a shared loop geothermal system pilot. And that was installed on the eastern end of Long Island in a town called Riverhead. And it was a relatively small 30-ton system connecting 10 single-family homes that were outside of our gas footprint. But it really gave us a chance to explore the technology, to understand the customer perspective and whether or not they had their needs met in a way that was palatable to them at a cost that was reasonable, and also in a way that felt like it could be done scalably, right? Recognizing the sort of different skills that are required to be installing closed loop vertical geothermal systems as opposed to simply horizontal piping. And we had, really good success with that project. We learned a lot from it. We engaged a lot with the geothermal industry. And so subsequent to that, we have filed for large geothermal demonstration projects in each of our rate cases. So that's 3 rate cases in a row that we filed for large programs, each one focused on a slightly different aspect of testing both the geothermal technology, its applicability across our customer population, and the business model. So we're really still trying to figure out what feels like that right fit for us to come in and add some value to the geothermal market such that it helps increase the adoption rate of the technology. We're not coming in and trying to say we have to do everything. We're just coming in and saying, we think this is an important technology for the future. How can we help?
Fantastic. Thank you for that perspective and a very interesting model to think through. Michael, I want to kick it to you next. And as you mentioned in your intro, you're someone who wears many hats here. So I think I'm very curious about both your direct experience at ENGIE and what y'all have seen in the geothermal market. And then, much like Jamie, being somebody at the University of Texas, right at the core of, a place that has been driving innovation and, drilling and geosciences for over a century now. I'd love to kind of hear what you're seeing from the academic standpoint as well.
Sure. Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some comments. So at ENGIE, I'm on the research innovation side. So Chief Science and Technology Officer there, not doing big business deployment, but trying to think about the future. In the short story is we think geothermal has a bigger opportunity to go in the future for a couple of reasons. One is just for background on ENGIE as a company. We have about 170,000 people in 70 countries, over 100 gigawatts of generating capacity, and we have gas networks in places like France and Brazil. So we sell gas and we sell electricity, and we have a pledge to decarbonize for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions by 2045, which is pretty aggressive. And for a company that sells gas and has like 50 gigawatts of gas power plants and a pledge to decarbonize for our customers and ourselves by 2045, we have to consider a lot of options. And the hardest part is figure out, what are we gonna do about the fuels? What are we gonna do about heat? And some of the gases maybe can be replaced by biogas, maybe by hydrogen, maybe gas or capture, maybe hydrogen carriers like ammonia or methanol or formic acid or something like that. But our customers also want heat. So we're getting more sophisticated with our demands of ourselves as a company for the future, but our customers in particular are getting more sophisticated with their demands. They want renewables, they want low carbon, they want 24/7 baseload operation for data centers or whatever they're operating. And they all know and like wind and solar because they're familiar with it, but we all recognize there's some limits in how far that takes you on 24/7 operation. So you need some sort of balancing force. That could be storage, that could be the gas turbines with the low carbon gases, and it could be geothermal, either for direct application of heat or for power generation. So our customers are asking more tricky questions, and I'm sure that's true for National Grid and LADWP as well. Is like the customers know more than they used to. They are getting more particular with what they want, and we have to come up with some solutions. So for us as a company, where we pledge zero carbon by 2045, the easy solutions are build more wind, solar, and acquire hydro. We like hydro. It's hard to build hydro, so it's mostly an acquisition target. But geothermal is something we can build. And in the near term, we don't see it in the next 2 to 4 years as a big part. But as you said, Tim, it's the geothermal decade, but in the 5 years now, geothermal grows. Some things that we think will be required for geothermal to really take off is sort of just more mature supply chains. As we do more of it in the world and deploy more, the cost for all the relevant parts and tools and bits and pieces will come down. And I think that price drop will be important. We also think policy is relevant and will matter. The more we care about the pollutants, the standard pollutants, as well as the greenhouse gases, then geothermal looks more competitive. And the more we care about reliability and balancing capability in the grid, where traditional balancing sources might be less able to grow, like hydro, or less attractive, like natural gas, then we're going to need something else. So geothermal looks more attractive as we go out into the future from the ENGIE perspective, especially for our customers' demands for low carbon. From the university perspective, we're also doing some research on low carbon pathways of the future of Texas and elsewhere. And we see some synergies with the oil and gas sector in terms of capability of doing project development, drilling. Oil and gas historically looks for oil and gas, or looks for oil and finds gas by accident. But I say it looks for oil and finds gas in hot water. And hot water is one of those valuable byproducts. And what if we use that byproduct for beneficial purposes? Or what if we looked for hot water on purpose? but using some of the same subsurface expertise and some of the same drilling and project management. For a place like Texas or other historical oil and gas producing regions, this is pretty exciting as a future for the industry as a whole, while helping the customers meet their targets. The customers have spoken, the markets have spoken, now we need to provide some solutions. So from the university hat, I see geothermal having a pretty important role for the future with some of these labor justice benefits and things like that. And from the corporate perspective, we see geothermal has a future. Frankly, it's got a very tricky immediate term, at least in a place like France. In the next year or two, it's just a lot easier to build wind and solar, frankly, so far. But we think as California figures it out for the rest of us, we'll be able to ride the coattails on the lower costs that California brings to market, and then we'll be able to do more projects worldwide. We have some geothermal in Indonesia. We're looking at it in more places. We see its benefits, but want to see the cost curves drop. And of course, that's what people like you are doing. One last comment I will say is that there's also a vibrant venture community now in geothermal in a way that there wasn't, say, a decade ago. And so you're getting new kinds of money in this space, not just the traditional private equity money or project money or bond or debt, or even ESG money. Venture money is getting here. And so that might have an ability to accelerate some of these discrete technologies we need to drive down costs. So a pretty exciting future for geothermal. We're looking at it from all sorts of directions, and I see a lot of potential for sure.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. That's great insight. And we're certainly seeing that at Fervo. There's a much bigger interest from the venture capital community in driving forward innovation in geothermal as they're seeing these same trends. And we've clearly been a beneficiary of that to date. And also want to talk about how much the story about oil and gas synergies resonates with me. I mean, I started my career as a drilling engineer in the oil and gas industry, and it was really looking at how advanced the technology had become in oil and gas and where that might be applied in geothermal that really attracted me to this sector many years ago when I first became interested. So very much appreciate that perspective. A comment I'll make, everyone who's watching, I think we want this to be an open discussion. So if anybody has questions that they want to send in, we can, and please do so, and we'll do our best to get to them. But in the meantime, I think I've got a couple other questions that I'd just love to double click on with the panel here. I think first, Jason, if I could kick it back to you. I mean, we've referenced this LA 100 study a couple of times. I think for anybody who may not be familiar with it, I'd love for you to describe, how it came together, what the purpose of it was, and how is LADWP using the results of that study to tangibly change how you're making planning decisions going forward. I think just a little bit more background on and context on that study would be very informative. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, so I think many folks here are going to be familiar with the state of California's 2045 goal of getting to 100%. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room in that definition about what's going to be defined as carbon free. There's strict definitions of renewables within the state of California. And these are great goals for the state and for utilities to have. But what we didn't see was what are the major investments that we need to make in order to get there. Of course, we know we need more renewables and we need more flexible resources and storage. But how much, what are these cost declines going to look like? What is it going to mean for the rest of the city? What is it going to mean for rates? LADWP is an extraordinarily diverse city from many perspectives. And one of those perspectives is economically. 47% of the city is a disadvantaged community. So we also looked at what's the impact of these communities and their ability to share in the investments and the benefits and the outcomes of getting to 100% renewable energy. So we partnered with the National Renewable Lab back in 2016. We spent 3 years developing this study. But what we did, and I think for any of the other utilities that are considering something like this, we brought in an advisory group of dozens of folks from the city, leaders in regional leaders at the state level, to help shape the different ways we looked at getting to 100%. And they spent 3+ years of their professional career meeting with us every quarter, giving us significant feedback and actually helping to shape the study. So I think it's a lesson in getting engagement on a subject that is extraordinarily complex. It seems very simple for those who are casually interested in decarbonization of power grids, but it's extraordinarily complex. And so that really helped us get some buy-in. And so we ended up with 4 major pathways. Of course, there's many, many pathways, but we looked at 4 major pathways that said, what if we really focused on local resources? We really maxed out local resources. And then we said, well, what if we said, let's build some new transmission lines and let's really get those low cost utility scale things in there. And we found a number of things. It's going to cost us $50 to $80 billion. We know we can get to 100%. We actually know we can get there by 2035. And we know under any scenario, we need, even in a scenario where we don't really max out transmission, we need more transmission. And I want to emphasize that because I told you earlier that LADWP has 25% of the capacity in the state of California. We're only 10% of the size. Even we need more transmission to access these renewable resources. And you said something that I'm going to borrow, and if I shouldn't, you let me know. You said that, we're not unique, we're the first. And I think the rest of the country is starting to realize that, yeah, we always knew we need more renewable energy. We didn't realize how much more. And I think a lot of other utilities won't realize that until they start to look at the benefits of electric vehicles, which really pushes up demand, which means you need even more renewable energy. So I'll leave it there. And I usually try to take an opportunity to really emphasize, the transmission piece of this, which has a whole lot of relevance for, I think, that, the subject that we're talking about here today. And then, the last piece that I'll mention is what you had said, which is, geothermal is potentially going to be a really big piece of that future. And I think we had identified under some scenarios reaching, potentially 1,000 more megawatts for the city of LA, which again, is a big deal for given the size of our service territory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I that message on transmission cannot be hammered home enough. And I think we're seeing that. And that's luckily when, one of the things about geothermal is being somewhat a smaller resource we're often forgotten about. But in the transmission side, it's one area where we share a common interest in other renewables and in the utilities. And so it's something that I think we're looking forward to seeing federal action on and more investment in innovative models to bring more transmission about, because it's absolutely of first order importance to addressing climate change. So I'm really glad that you're highlighting that. Owen, I'm curious to kick it to you for a question here. One thing that you said that was very informative about the planning cycle was that it's great that we're doing very long-term planning cycle, because that's what geothermal needs. Maybe I can flip that question around on you though. And why is it that geothermal needs such a long planning cycle, and what can the utility do to try to make that faster so it can be a much more fast growing and responsive resource? I mean, where are you seeing the major timeline barriers right now, and how would you go about fixing those?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tim. So I think as those of us that are kind of familiar with I'll call it small scale or low temperature geothermal for the use of heating, as opposed to high temperature geothermal for power generation, which is often, we're kind of mixing the topics here on the panel. So I'll do my best to keep things clear in my comments. As we think about that, tends to come with a very high capital cost, right? The drilling of the boreholes and the installation of the geo-exchange capacity. In addition to the equipment, there's a fair amount of disruption relative to some of the alternative technologies that people are using today, be that a fossil fuel-based system or something more like an air source heat pump or a cold climate air source heat pump in our region. And so as consumers are looking at geothermal, they tend to be thinking, there's going to be some disruption to my property potentially. And that can be true in other solutions as well. I'm not trying to pick on geothermal, but also there's a pretty high cost relative to some of these alternatives. Is it worth it? And, the answer in terms of sort of the higher efficiency can be that there are lower operating costs going forward, but consumers are usually looking at sort of and I'm going to use rough numbers here, $7,000 to $10,000 for an air source heat pump, or $30,000 to $40,000 for a geothermal heat pump. Yes, there are, income tax credits. Yes, there are sometimes utility rebates, but the math just becomes a little bit more complicated. And so whether or not people are doing that calculation of the payback time for these systems and whether it's going to work and does it provide a different level of reliability than some of the alternatives, I think that that's not happening necessarily as much as we might like. And that's one of the things we're trying to think about. How can we inform customers and make it easy for them to be considering the alternatives across the life cycle of the equipment and the life cycle of the investment decision? So as we think about what we do as a utility, investing in these large scale capital projects where we're saying, we're only going to charge you the 1 year depreciation in any of the kind of rate making cycles, right? That's the way we've done this historically. So we've spread the cost of these large systems over many years and over many customers, which has made it mostly palatable in terms of the rates that are charged to consumers. And so it's something that we could be doing for a different asset class, including, we feel, geothermal ground loops. So if we did it in that way, and instead of offering it as, you pay $30,000 up front, or you have to go and secure some third-party financing to go with this. It could be provided by the utility, potentially as part of a shared loop or a district thermal system, which would allow us to take advantage of some of the balancing aspects of that shared loop, capturing the differential and diverse heating and cooling load profiles of different customers. There may be some benefit there. It's certainly going to be a question of when it's most appropriate and under what conditions it works best. But we feel like there's an opportunity there. And if there is going to be a large scale transition in the type of equipment that's being installed as we look to 2030, 2040, 2050, we want to make sure we're being thoughtful about those decisions and that we're doing everything we can to improve the efficiency, right? Because I know we talk a lot about deep decarbonization and getting eventually to net zero. But to me, coming from my background, which is certainly not as strong as Michael's in the engineering space, but having a little bit of an engineering background, the more we can reduce the total amount of energy that's required to meet the needs of our society, the easier it's going to be to decarbonize whatever is left over. So we shouldn't be investing in things that feel like they are less efficient than some of the technologies that are out there. And so if there's a way that we can support that, efficiency investment, so to speak, it's certainly something we want to be looking at.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a great list of things to be working on to help accelerate the sector. Michael, I'll turn it over to you for a quick question. You've discussed a little bit your experience with ENGIE and developing plants in Indonesia and looking at the market there, as well as the heat projects here. If you could maybe summarize, what were the top lessons learned for a company taking first steps into geothermal, and how are you going to apply those forward?
Great question. A couple of key lessons with Indonesia. The project didn't work as easily as we thought, although it's working. And this is one of the things with above ground wind or above ground solar radiation. It's much easier to get the data on what the resource is like. With below ground things, it takes more expertise. It's easy to miss the hotspot and you get half the capacity you thought, or that kind of thing. And those were things for us like, okay, we have to build in, at least now for our project planning purposes, more risk that it might not quite perform the way we want. And that will affect our ability to bid and everything else. We see the resources there, but it's easy to miss the spot. So we might need different skill sets, different partners, different kind of bidding, different kind of uncertainty. So that's one takeaway from Indonesia. And frankly, I think it's lessons like that make it easier for us just to focus on wind and solar for now. The capacity for the grid to take on wind and solar has not been saturated yet. It will be at some point, and at that point, geothermal's role will certainly grow. But until then, it's easier for us to gain experience more slowly on geothermal, build as much wind and solar as possible, acquire hydro, and then we'll overcome some of those lessons learned. We see a more natural fit, at least for now, with geothermal for the ground source heat pumps for district heating. We're a big believer in district heating. We think those kind of decentralized infrastructures, microgrid scale infrastructures, is where a lot of the future will be, for the reasons that you already heard from our other speakers. I mean, we are a big believer that we need more transmission, but anytime you can build a system that avoids transmission also adds value. And so one of the things we find appealing about geothermal, we've learned from our heating districts, is it has a modular scale. You can do geothermal at small sizes for heat at a district level or household level, and at large scales for multi-hundred megawatt power plants and that kind of thing. And that modularity and scale has good engineering performance benefits. It also has convenient finance benefits, because maybe you only have a certain amount of capital or can only get access to a certain amount of capital. And not all energy solutions have that modularity of scale. Natural gas does. You can go from small microturbines to very large power plants. Solar can scale very easily. Nuclear does not scale. It's mostly large, although people are trying to build smaller scale nuclear. Coal does not scale down. Wind does not scale down. And so the scale flexibility of geothermal is pretty attractive. And we see that already deploying as fast as we can for district heating. And then that's one of our lessons learned, like, okay, this is pretty straightforward for district heating. Maybe you need a little direct electric or gas backup, but ground source can provide most of your needs. And then for power plants, we got to be more thoughtful about the risks of the project. In a place like California or Iceland, where there's a lot of experience, I think that is de-risked already a little bit. Then if you're going into new locations and that kind of thing. So those are some of our lessons learned. It's enough to make us think twice, but not enough to stop us. And we think, that's why I mentioned, I want to thank California for sort of de-risking for the world. That's often the role for California, is to be the first adopter and the leader. And the lessons learned there will be applied elsewhere. So I think it's great. And California has very particular problems it needs to solve, where California can't just burn stuff the way other people do because of the way the nature is with the Central Valley. It traps the air pollution. And California is very exposed to the risk of climate change because it might really torch the forests or cause other problems. So the financial risk of climate change and the financial risk of air quality problems in California puts it in position to lean on this, and we will all benefit. So I think ENGIE as a company in the world will get to learn a lot from what they developed for us.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you for that. And I think that people should tune in to a lot of the other panels this week to discuss the different exciting things going on the technology side of things to help address some of those challenges that you brought up, Michael. And it's one thing that I always think about is we spend a lot of time talking about learning curves in the abstract, and they've certainly done wonders for the wind and solar industry. But what implied in the learning curve is doing the first set of projects is sometimes painful, and that's why you can learn from them. So it's clear that y'all have had that experience, but it's good to know that y'all are incorporating those lessons into driving down the cost for future projects rather than moving on, because that's the only way to make learning curves work. So I appreciate that. I want to thank everybody who's sent questions in so far. We've gotten a number of good questions from the audience, and we'll continue to review those. I think I'm going to combine several of them into a theme, which maybe Jason, I'll put you on the spot first, but would love to get the other panelists to weigh in too. And that really comes down to how utilities value geothermal. I think, the title of this panel was called Green Baseload. And we in the geothermal community spend a lot of time talking about value, whether it's flexibility or environmental attributes or however, but the common discourse is all dominated by LCOE, least cost, levelized cost of electricity. And that's clearly what has allowed wind and solar to take off. So I think to some kind of cobbling a couple questions together on this value question is how is it that utilities assign value to different resources, and what justifies moving just beyond cost when it comes to making procurement decisions on behalf of utilities? And would just love some insight into how that process works at your organization.
Yeah, so I'll talk about it from two perspectives. One is the models that have led us to believe that we'll need a significant amount of resources and how those are actually selected from the models. And I'll try to give a simplified summary of how they arrive at that, in part because I'm not an expert in those models. So the best you're going to get from me is a lay description of how that works. But essentially, particularly with the LA 100 study, our requirements are put into the model, all the prices, the price estimates, the time of delivery, the projected cost declines, and the reality that we have an existing and potentially growing transmission system. And the resources are actually produced as part of the capacity expansion model. And you actually see resources that vary significantly in cost because it's trying to achieve different goals. And some of the goals have to do with cost. Some of the goals have to do with reliability and resiliency. So you'll see things in the model like, leveraging biofuels for, on-demand, capacity, particularly within the city of LA, in the event that we lose our transmission import capability. You see under certain scenarios, the capacity expansion model say you need some, hydrogen and that sort of thing. And similarly, and of course, geothermal's costs are significantly below those two. You see those show up in the model, regardless of the fact that there might be, extraordinarily low cost solar. And part of it is because you look at all hours of the year, and you look at all hours of the year under various conditions, under, conditions where you might lose, your largest assets. So that's part of the outcome of the modeling. Now from, how do you go from there to actually putting that into practice when you're actually trying to sign up these contracts? And for us, and I think some utilities might have a similar approach, is it's about least cost, best fit. And we often sign contracts that may not be the lowest cost in the stack of proposals that we have at any given time. And we've got a rolling RFP. It's open all year. And if a proposal comes in and it's a high price but in great location, we let them know, and they try to work to get that price to something that's a little bit more competitive. And again, not necessarily benchmarked against different technologies because they're going to have different uses. And similarly, if there's a phenomenal price project, but it's nowhere near our balancing authority, nowhere near our ability to bring it home, then that's a challenge for us. And so it really comes down to recognizing the least cost best fit model, not only fit being location. but fit being the hours of the year that you actually need it. So, anytime we're evaluating any project, whether it's, wind, solar, geothermal, whatever it is, we put that into our model and we determine what that value is for us. In some scenarios, we've looked at some solar projects and we've talked about, could we just overbuild the batteries along with this to actually mimic something that might be a little bit closer to baseload? And sometimes that drives the cost so high that it no longer makes sense. Maybe there's a scenario like that might work in the future if there's other resources like geothermal that aren't available. But hopefully that gives you an idea that at least for LED2BP, it's not all about cost. Obviously, we want the lowest cost, but the lowest cost options don't serve all of your needs. The same thing's true for storage too. A lot of people say, well, just build a bunch of lithium ion storage and you've built your way out of having peaking capacity. And we know from the NREL study, that's not possible. We can't build a resilient and reliable system without some type of renewable combustion, whether it's biofuels or hydrogen, or some other long duration storage capability that doesn't exist yet. So I'll pause there, and hopefully I've given you the sufficient background that it's not all about price. That's a big piece, but it's not all about price.
No, that's fantastic context and actual insight into how a utility thinks about it. I think the power industry has done ourselves a disservice by only talking about the price side of the equation. And sometimes the analogy I like to give is, imagine if Consumer Reports was evaluating the automotive industry and they put out a report that said, here's the price of a Honda and here's the price of a Ferrari, and then everybody went out and wrote about, wow, what's wrong with Ferrari? They cost 10 times as much as these other vehicles. No one's ever going to buy it, but that's what we do. And energy resources have different attributes. I'm going to talk my book as somebody in the geothermal sector. I think we are the Ferrari of the power sector. I mean, we're a resource that works all the time, carbon free, and because of technologies that you're hearing about this week, we're going to do it for lower cost and in more places, and we're not really given that recognition. So I really like that framework of making sure we're moving beyond price. Owen or Michael, I think Owen, it's a little bit different on the heat side, but would love maybe to put the same question to either of y'all as, how do you think about value for different resources, and how would you justify supporting investment in more geothermal?
So I think it is a little bit different on the heat side, but maybe not as different as it might seem at kind of first glance. Baseload is kind of an interesting term. It can usually either refer to something that's a constant offtake or something that's a constant supply. One of the things from the natural gas industry that we're kind of familiar with in terms of baseload is renewable natural gas projects, where once you sort of get the anaerobic digester up and spinning, or the landfill starts producing methane, it kind of produces the same amount every single day, other than maintenance outages and things like that. And that can actually be a challenge, because if the demand for the gas is not high enough and you're not able to interconnect into a part of the system where it has high flow, then you can run into situations where you just have too much gas, right? So that base load can be challenging. Similarly, if you have a base load draw of gas, that can be difficult to manage in a supply stack. So base load is kind of a good thing, but can have some operational challenges. The exciting thing about geothermal is kind of a green base load is it's always available, even if you don't necessarily need to use it. Right. And that's how I think of it as a baseload resource, is effectively, if you put in a geothermal system for heating, and again, talking about kind of that low temperature district geothermal system, it could effectively not use the geo exchange, but for on those days when it's really cold, where the air source system theoretically might start to see some efficiency drop off. And I'm not trying to besmirch air source systems. I'm just saying that in really cold regions, we want to make sure that there is reliable heating capacity on the peak days. And the reason for that from the natural gas industry perspective is because, of course, as Michael even alluded to, right? If there's a little bit of gas for backup, that means we have to maintain this massive network of gas piping. And that's what we do today. And that makes a lot of sense when there is a lot of flow through that system, because that's the way that the industry has kind of been built up. If in the future the amount of flow is different, or the policies are changing what that system is going to look like, what we don't want to end up with is a system where people say, I'm going to kind of undersize one system because I'm expecting something to be there, and then potentially that is not there, or the cost of that is different, right? So it's a little bit of a challenge there. So having that kind of green base load of the geothermal capacity to ensure that you have efficiency and enough heating on those peak days, so that customers have their needs met, so that their homes are warm enough and that they're safe, which of course is critical for us, is really something that we see as being exciting about the technology. So that's kind of the perspective that we bring to it and why we think of it as being a valuable addition to the conversation around heating solutions for the future.
Fantastic. That's also a very useful perspective to hear about the heat side. And Michael, I don't know, you're the one that could cover either or both if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. So just build on Jason's and Owen's comments a little bit. I agree with everything they're saying. Heat really has an important reliability metric, as you heard, that certainly large heat consumers are worried about price, but they're more worried about reliability, because a couple of days of downtime can be really devastating for the production of the product they're selling, but also to the equipment itself, because it's hard to ramp up and down some of these facilities. I'm thinking like smelters, but also glass furnaces and different types of industries that really want heat to be available reliably. And they also sometimes don't mind paying more, because if it's cleaner, they can use that to get like a green premium for their product from certain types of customers and partners. And certainly there's new forms of capital through ESG investing requirements that might be available for it. So the price might not be the first question, it might be second or third. It's beyond some of these other attributes, which I think are very important. I want to build a little bit on what Jason was talking about, also just sort of the rise of different options. And if you look at wind and solar on average, I'm a big fan of wind and solar. And if you look at them on average, they're the winner for everything. But as Jason said, you don't do grid planning that way. You don't do grid planning on average. You do grid planning for every hour of the year, for average weather, typical weather, but also extreme weather. And it is possible in places like Europe to have weeks on end with clouds and no wind. And it's possible to have that in California, Texas as well. And that's why you always need some sort of balancing authority. Now, in Europe, it's Norway with hydro, or in some other places in the Alps. And in the Western grid of the United States, like 23% of the generation over a year is hydro. In the Eastern grid in America, it's 4%. In Texas, it's like 0.3%. So when we had a crisis in February that we went through, Tim and I, we didn't have the normal balancing of hydro that most grids in the world rely on. In Texas, we rely on gas. That's 50% of our generation, and it's our balancing force. The gas froze up, the gas supply froze up, and the gas power plants froze up. And we didn't have hydro to balance out like most grids do. Geothermal would have been pretty nice. Now, geothermal could freeze up potentially if the fluids aren't handled the right way. But we know with Iceland, it can be done in cold weather. And the fuel won't freeze up, the earth won't freeze up. Well, if it does, we have bigger problems, I'll say it that way. Gas froze up, coal piles froze up. We don't use nuclear for balancing because nuclear is usually already at full capacity. So if you look at what grids need for reliability, you need something. And if hydro is not available, you might use geothermal. And if hydro is available, you might use geothermal anyway. So I think we got to add these resilience and other attributes into our factors. And Tim, your point is really important. Consumer reports would never look just at price. They always look at a whole matrix of performance capabilities. And we don't shop for cars on price. We don't shop for food on price, housing on price. Price is certainly a factor, but a lot of us will pay too much for a meal because we like the ambiance, or they've got better drinks, or we like the outdoor seating. We'll often pay more for housing to get into a different neighborhood. Anybody who drives a car more than $15,000 is paying for something like performance or cargo capability or prestige or brand or something, because you can get a 5-seater that's pretty safe car for $15,000. And so I often do that. People ask me like, well, when are we going to, when is XYZ type of energy going to be at price parity? And I'll do a survey in the room. How many of you drive a BMW or an Acura? And a lot of hands go. I was like, okay, you're not shopping on price parity. Like you're paying more because you're getting something you perceive out of it. And we'll do the same thing with energy as we give more options to the consumer. And the consumers are more savvy, as I mentioned at the top of the hour. They're starting to ask these kind of questions. They want more than just cost. They want reliability, cleanliness, compatibility with the environment, or whatever it is. So I basically agree with Jason, Noah, and all of you. I just wanted to add those additional comments.
That's great, Michael. And I should do a better job citing you. I'm pretty sure I had the idea for this Consumer Reports price analogy because I was in the audience one time when you asked people what kind of car they drove. So
I mean, we obsess about levelized cost of energy. What levelized cost is only useful for certain types of forms of energy and power, and that's not the way we make decisions for most things in life, frankly.
And I think one thing just to add on that too is that the divergence between LCOE and value is really minimal whenever you're talking about very low penetrations of resources. And it's something that grows over time. So I think of as we look past the last decade, it hasn't really been an issue yet. And in some cases, we've gotten complacent because we say, well, it hasn't been a problem yet. It won't be a problem in the future. But it's as you get to deeper levels of decarbonization where that diverges. So I think that's important. Kind of a quick hit follow-up to this. Another question we got from the audience. if you can, is they said a lot of panels are about reducing costs this week. What is the cost target geothermal needs to achieve for to get wholesale buy-in from utilities? And I know it's going to be different in every market and every situation, but I do wonder if anybody's willing to step up and comment about what kind of cost reductions they would like to see geothermal really flourish.
Well, maybe I'll go first. And I just said cost doesn't matter. Now I'm going to say actually cost does matter for certain types of governments and certain types of customers and for certain types of sources. And it looks to me like geothermal's competitor is often nuclear in terms of low carbon, high capacity factor sources, especially new build. And if you compare new build geothermal with new build nuclear, geothermal looks very good today. However, in the markets, it feels like geothermal is often competing with 40-year-old nuclear, in which case the price points are a lot lower. So we'll see. It might depend on whether it's a green build or brownfield and that kind of thing. But I would say from the energy perspective, we sure like to see geothermal prices drop. That might not be necessary today. Well, it would be necessary today. It might not be necessary in the future when we start to saturate some locations what wind and solar can provide. We'll need to get to something else. And I think there's a lot of agreement in the analytical world that wind and solar can do at least 60%, but there's a lot of disagreement about whether 60% is the maximum, or is it 70% or 90% or whatever. And at some point, it gets really hard to do just wind and solar. And so you need something else. And how does geothermal compete with some of those other options? So that's my long way of saying, I don't know.
I guess I'll jump in here and just add to that, Tim, that when we're thinking about the cost of geothermal, really we're just looking at the total cost for consumers, right? We know that there's going to be a lot of spend in the energy transition. We know that that's going to mean a lot of investment, and we want to make sure that that is not an investment that is simply being put onto the backs of our ratepayers and the backs of our customers. We need to try to think about what the total cost is and what's sort of reasonable, because the way the utility industry is sort of structured is that it is a recovery of prudent cost. And so therefore, the cost of the technology has to pass that prudency test for us. So we don't have a particular number in mind. It's just that's the kind of framework that we're using, given that we're still kind of early days in the technology, to think about how we would look at this is what are the alternatives, what are customers paying today, what's their total energy wallet, and how would the cost of service provided by a geothermal or a district system compare to that, both in the near term and in the future.
Yeah, I'll just add that, and I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of factors that go into selecting, contracts that we want to begin negotiating on. I think a lot of the prices for geothermal projects tend to be in ranges that are high enough to where we start to look at, solar with a lot of overbuilt storage. Will that prove out to actually provide a comparable product? Maybe not. Maybe in some cases it will. But when we see geothermal prices that are in the mid 60s for dollars per megawatt hour, that's where it starts to be in the ballpark of being able to look at solar and storage. Now, when you get it a little bit lower than that, when you get it into the mid 50s, high 50s, that's where it starts to look like a resource that when you get to that ballpark, it's really hard to beat it with any other resource. So obviously recognizing that that's very, very difficult. Not, sometimes it takes really, great, circumstances to be able to reach that. But to just be totally blunt, once you're in that ballpark, it's really hard to replicate that with a competing product.
Yeah, that's encouraging for me to hear as a developer. I mean, we see PPA pricing and know that current geothermal contracts in the U.S. are usually at the higher end of that range. But I think one thing that's always appealed to me as geothermal, in contrast to other resources, is what you just said, Jason. I mean, we're talking about a 10 or 20% cost reduction, and it's an unbeatable resource. And it's very different than some of the other initiatives that are going on in the power sector, where the numbers are a lot more than a 10 or 20% reduction in cost. So I find that quite doable. Another question we're getting in some ways, there's a few questions in this coming in from the audience around the importance of different attributes of geothermal. I think we titled this panel green baseload. But I think one of the things, the conversation around power has moved beyond baseload to talking about specific attributes like if it's firm power or if it's dispatchable power, and thinking about ramping needs. And there's some questions in here about how y'all view those. I mean, how important is it for geothermal to be a flexible resource versus a baseload resource? And how do y'all think about making decisions around that?
We've done a lot of research at the University of Texas on grid reliability, and after Winter Storm Uri, the different conservation alerts in Texas in the last few months. I know California's had different issues of wildfires. We all have our problems. But one of the reliability issues that gets not enough attention is rotational inertia, which is the benefit of rotating machinery to do frequency management of an AC synchronous grid. And the highest performing from an inertia perspective is gas turbines, followed by combined cycle, followed by steam turbines. And you get to like hydroelectric and geothermal turbines. But asynchronous systems like wind and solar or batteries don't provide inertia. There'll be some digital versions that will give some synthetic inertia, but the fact that geothermal could be designed with rotating machines actually is really interesting from a frequency reliability perspective. And generally speaking, the grid operators know this, but they don't have markets associated with it. ERCOT has proposed on occasion in the past to create a rotational inertia market where we have a certain minimum rotational inertia we need in ERCOT, about 100 gigawatt seconds. And usually we don't get close, but if you have a low demand moment in, say, March or September, and a lot of gas is offline and maybe a nuke goes offline and a private use network goes offline, wind and solar might really mess up your rotational inertia. So creating a rotational inertia or rewarding people for that would be interesting. And geothermal would be a beneficiary of that kind of reliability metric. It's kind of undervalued in my opinion.
Thanks, Michael. Any comments, Jason or Owen, on the importance of being a baseload resource versus a flexible resource, and other attributes that you would like to see out of geothermal as more comes online?
Yeah, I think the concept that Michael just brought up is a really important one, especially for some utilities that might have some really serious needs for that. One example of that is, we've got some, DC lines that require a minimum level of, rotating mass to be able to be operated. So I would imagine that other utilities might be in a similar situation to that. And it's actually not something that was, top of mind when we began this discussion. So that's one that I would definitely, agree with. I will say that there are some scenarios where we actually see a little bit of drop off in some of the really high heat, summer scenarios. So if there a way to, bring that up or somehow bring that cost down to a level commensurate with what what it's providing in some of its lower periods. Again, recognizing that is also very difficult to do, but maybe there's, some way to, and I'm just thinking out loud, sort of like, provide that base load, and then sort of the excess power might be, available to be, operated as a merchant or sold to other utilities or sold as part of a different contract. I don't know, but that is one, piece that is a little bit challenging for us when we see some proposals come in with, some drop off in what that, expected capacity will be, particularly through the summer. Now things are going to change, 5-10 years down the road. I would just, I would say that there certainly would be value in the flexibility, but I don't know that it will be the same year in and year out. The different mix of resources is going to change. So I would imagine that may change, in the future too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as you look at how the grid is evolving, and in particular in the Western US where solar is coming on so much. If you were to look, just a few years ago, that peak summer capacity was the most important attribute a lot of times in looking at projects. And now that solar has become so widespread, it's starting to shift into very different time periods. And so I think it is interesting to think about, geothermal is a resource that works with lower efficiency during high temperature days and higher efficiency during the evening and the night in the winter. And that used to be a major detraction. But if you talk about going onto a solar heavy grid, that might be a lot more attractive now than it used to be. So I think that's definitely an interesting point to think about, not just where it is today, but where the grid's going. I think, Owen, I don't know if there's a similar concept around dispatchability, and you already talked about it being there always on when it comes to heat, but maybe to pose the question in a slightly different way that's more relevant for heat is, how important I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of your market is a winter peaking grid and sees these very high instantaneous loads on cold days. How important is that, shaving that demand using geothermal in like that specific day? And how does that end up getting reflected into the value of the system?
So I like to think of it in a slightly different way, which is that, again, going back to kind of the engineering framework I talked about earlier, there's a certain amount of energy that is required on those days. We see very sort of synchronous load profiles on those days because we have a lot of very temperature dependent usage on the system, Tim, as you mentioned, right? And of course, it's winter peaking, but there are also then hours within the day where we're seeing the strongest draw from customers. And of course, it's as we would expect, kind of morning and evening when all the facilities are heating up, and then when everyone's kind of coming home from the office, or at least when we used to be coming home from the office and now are just simply cooking dinner at home for many of us. And so having the capacity available on that day is critical. And so the way I've sort of thought about geothermal for heating is that if in the future, and I have yet to find a study that kind of refutes the idea that electrification is going to play a large part of a lot of end uses in the future, and I haven't found one that says it's not going to be there. So as we think about electrification, the question becomes, does it have the capacity on the peak days, on those days when everybody is drawing on the system to provide the heat load that is needed? And then if so, does it do it in a way that creates problems when you get to scale for the electric grid? Right? Because that's the other thing we have to be thinking about. This is no longer the problem of, the gas industry or the electric industry. We're trying to get through this together and figure out the best solution together. And so if we put in a lot of systems that rely on resistant strip heating or some other kind of form of backup heating, we have to be factoring that into the equation, right? That's going back to the Honda versus the Ferrari. If the Ferrari has the capability on the day that you really need the reliability to deliver it, and to do so in a way that, again, looking at the long-term economics and operability for the customers, that it makes the most sense from their perspective, from kind of the system investment perspective, then that's something that certainly we want to consider. So I'm really thinking about the addition of the geo exchange to a heating system being that form of supplemental heat. And in an air source system, perhaps it would be a strip heater, or it would be a gas backup system, or some other backup system, right? But here we're adding in this kind of passive geo exchange that is there if you need it, but you don't have to leverage it, right? It's not required during a lot of the hours of the year, but by using it in an intelligent way, by having controls and equipment that take advantage of the resource, you're able to get a very good outcome for customers. And so I think that's what's exciting about it from, again, kind of that heat peak day management perspective.
Yeah, thanks. That's great insight. And actually, I've got time for one final question that we've got from the audience, and then we'll wrap up with a closing statement at the end. But something that's been hit on quite a bit, and Michael, you brought up Winter Storm Uri a couple times, and I think it actually dovetails well with what Owen was talking about, which is meeting that with a highly electrified system is difficult when you're talking about instantaneous peak winter demand. And I wonder, just generically on that topic, in the last year, we've seen major events in really every territory that each of you is active in or lives in, and in terms of resilience and reliability. And how has the conversation changed? What's different now?
Well, I'd like to say the conversation has improved. Actually, I think it's gone backwards. So we're gone into retrograde on this somehow. So Winter Storm Uri was bad, but we also had an event a few weeks ago that was not as bad, but was making us nervous. And what happens in a place like Texas now, where we're 50% gas and 20% wind and solar for our power generation, is that if both are unavailable at the same time, we have real problems because they're 75% of the system, 70% of the system. And in Winter Storm Uri, it was a particularly cold, but also windless event. And it was also a wet event. And so you had precipitation forming on ice blades, forming on wind blades, forming like ice javelins and this kind of thing, covering solar panels, but also causing the freeze offs of the gas system. For their conservation alerts a few weeks ago, it was a little less windy, but wind turbines weren't working the way we wanted, but gas in particular wasn't working the way we wanted. So this is a real problem. So you think we should be diversifying our grid and that kind of thing. But instead, the conversation's really been focused on whether you like wind versus gas. So it's become like wind is what liberals, environmentalists, and Democrats want. Natural gas is what like Americans, Republicans, capitalists like, or what. It's just like this silly, stupid identity politics that makes no sense and doesn't solve the problem. And geothermal is interesting because it might be one of those that is sort of a safe harbor where we can like it because it requires drilling holes in the ground and it's renewable. So maybe it's the one that everyone will like. We haven't gotten there yet, but I would say the conversation really hasn't improved in Texas. It's gotten really specifically worse. And so that makes me kind of nervous, but I think grid planners are starting to take these other attributes in mind. Hopefully we'll move things forward.
Great. I don't know, Jason or Owen, if either of y'all wants to jump in and discuss how the conversation around reliability and resilience has changed in the last couple of years.
I could quickly share from my perspective. I mean, we've got an interesting service territory here where, for any of you who can, picture Los Angeles, we're in Southern California, and I mentioned we've got a bunch of transmission lines. All of those come into the northern part of the city, and we actually have in basin and within the city of LA thermal generation that helps push up against that power. So we bring in a lot of resources from the north, and we actually produce a lot of energy in the southern portion of our city, which has left us with a big challenge of when we see growing wildfires, what does that mean for our transmission, exposure? And we've actually had a number of cases where we've lost all that, capability. So we're looking at things like, how can we have renewable combustion within the city, whether it's biofuels or hydrogen, or some other long duration storage. And, does this mean that we really need to look at, trying to get another transmission corridor that has less geographic, risk exposure? So, from that perspective, it really has changed the way that we think of it. And it's extraordinarily hard to plan around that and to value that, because now you're talking about making investments that don't, these are about redundancy. This is about reliability. This is about, 20 hours of the year, not, 8760. It's a really, especially for a public utility, and I would imagine even, private, heavily regulated utilities, it's a tough discussion to have, and it's really tough to, put dollars around it and invest dollars into it. But the way we look at it is, we're not going to successfully decarbonize if we sacrifice reliability, because if we go so fast down that road and we get to high levels of renewable energy and we suffer from significant reliability resiliency impacts, we'll not have influenced others to follow us. In fact, we might have actually slowed the movement down. So that's the way we look at reliability and resiliency. I know that doesn't shed a whole lot of light on how do you actually make decisions based off that, but it is something that's really important for us to look at.
Yeah, that's very valuable. And I think that when you think about grid planning, the framework of cost, reliability, and environmental attributes being the three things that you plan for, I think it's very important to recognize, like you do, Jason, that you may think you can sacrifice on one of those things, but then you may actually end up hurting the others as a result. And I think that's exactly right. If we don't figure out how to do this in a way that's safe and transparent for consumers, then it's really going to hinder our ability to decarbonize the grid. So this has been a fantastic conversation. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'll just put it out there for anybody. If you have a closing thought you'd like to share with the group before we wrap here, in any order, feel free to hop in.
I like geothermal as an important way to diversify the fuel mix so that we reduce our risk of system-wide failure while also decarbonizing and leveraging existing skill sets in other parts of the energy sector, namely oil and gas. So I think it's one of those things that really solves many problems at once.
I'll just jump on sort of an extension of the last question to say, I'm very excited that we are at the point now where we're saying we're all agreed that deep decarbonization is critical and something that we're all committed to. Now it's a question of how do we do that, right? And how do we get there? And how do we ensure that it satisfies sort of that energy trilemma? And it's I think, no longer going to be sufficient to simply say, ideological statements. Instead, we have to come armed with data. We have to come ready to get into sort of that learning curve and put forth pilots and be ready to kind of experiment and try some different things, look at non-traditional sources of energy and non-traditional business models, because we're all going to have to evolve in order to satisfy what that future looks like and make sure that we're meeting the needs of customers.
Great. Jason, you want to chime in with any parting thoughts here?
Just really quickly, again, thank you for involving us. And we're really fortunate in that we've invested a lot of time in the planning aspect of this, but we're also really fortunate that we have access to a lot of different renewable resources, including geothermal. So, and I say that from the perspective of Los Angeles. So, we could do all the planning and modeling in the world, but should we not be able to reach those resources, we'd be in a very different state than we are now. So, it's a very exciting future that we have. But let's not forget what you said earlier, which is we really have to seize this decade. There is, and I'll emphasize it again, no matter how we get to 100% renewable energy, the next 10 years has so much commonality in investments that we need to make, which tells us we need to get moving now, and we need to really accelerate all of our efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just end by saying the same thing. We have to seize this decade. I think it's exciting for me to get together with three deep thinkers representing utilities from across the world, really, and see that for each one of you, geothermal is inching up the priority list for different reasons and is really a key part of addressing climate change and meeting our grid reliability goals. And I don't think this is a conversation we could have had a few years ago. And now that we're having it, it's time to absolutely jump on the moment and seize it. I think there's a lot of great sessions the rest of this week at Pivot. I want to thank the Pivot planning team and organization for convening this panel. Going to put in a quick plug. If you're not tired of seeing my face, we'll be doing a fireside chat. I will be doing a fireside chat with Jigar Shah from the Loan Program Office about how we take financing to get geothermal to the next level on Wednesday. So I look forward to seeing everybody again. And thank you again to Pivot for convening such a good group of folks for a conversation around the future of the grid. Thank you.
Thanks.